is a change maker focusing on expanding medical cannabis programs and equitable legislation. She's the former president and current vice chair of the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association. Before that, she was co-founder of Undaunted Ventures, a political consulting firm specializing in innovative narrative, training, leadership, coaching services. And that grew out of her work training organizations and working on campaigns throughout Virginia, which is actually, I think, when I first met you as well. She is the co-founder, co-director of New Leaders Council Virginia, a progressive leadership institute, and she holds a BA in public policy from the University of Chicago and a master's in public policy and management from Carnegie Mellon. She happily gives and receives recommendations for sci-fi novels and board games. So without further ado, please welcome Ngiste Abebe to the stage.
Oh, no, I have the laugh.
Never mind, I'll be quiet. I don't know what I'm doing.
Vanna got me set up. Well, good morning, everyone. Well, corruption is a heavy topic. So when Michelle called me and was like, I got something, I think you'd be perfect for it. And I was like, great. She's like, corruption. I was like, I'm not sure how to take this. I mean, I do work in politics. I grew up in Chicago. And I do vote early, but I only vote often because Virginia has elections all the damn time. So also please check if your voter registration is up to date. And if you need any help, happy to talk after the call, because once an organizer, always an organizer. Politics was really the focus in the write-up for explaining corruption for this month's theme. A lot of focus on those petty punishments, favors for favorites, and greedy egos that undermine fair systems. I've worked in politics. I've spent a few years working in Virginia campaigns after being a volunteer. That was the first step in me arriving in my current role, where I'm now a cannabis policy expert working for one of the largest medical and adult use cannabis operators in the country. Corruption is not always as obvious as we sometimes think it is. And I've seen politics from the inside and the outside and from lots of different vantage points. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the historical view, because America was not always very anti-corruption, at least on the surface. For much of American history, corruption was part of how our government worked. It was just thought to be part of the system. Again, I grew up in Chicago, where the Dailies were, across 2 generations, were mayors for 43 years and led a political machine that was renowned for its ability to move voters and to capture electoral cycles. It was just the latest iteration of things like Tammany Hall in New York City, and so many different local, state, federal instances of networks that, on the one hand, to the point that Michelle was talking about earlier, were originally formed to create power bases. Some of these, like Tammany Hall, were instrumental in elevating Irish Americans from being immigrants who were discriminated against to positions of power. But in the process, they built systems that relied on ward bosses, on political graft, using public taxpayer resources for preferential contracts that benefited personal pocketbooks, and sometimes even relied on violence in order to retain that power. And that's corruption, that we now have laws that try to combat it. We have procedures that are, like open solicitations for government contracts and other rules and laws that are trying to minimize that. But we know that it still manifests. I'm sure all of us can think of a few recent and not so recent examples of this. When I studied and worked in international affairs, you quickly notice that a lot of the anti-corruption work we're trying to export overseas are lessons that we've learned from the corruption that we have here in America. And that, again, when systems are broken, corruption shows up because people need to survive. And so corruption starts getting bribes are written into the budget of a business. They are assumed costs of operation in certain communities, in certain cultures, in certain governments. We've also seen anti-corruption campaigns used as political warfare, not to fight corruption, but to fight political opponents. So now we are seeing anti-corruption being corrupted, and it seems like corruption has no limits and no bounds. I'm sure that somewhere somebody will make the argument that this is just a free market exercise in understanding the value of government services. But the reality is, when you have these informal systems, which is what corruption is creating around a formalized government system that everybody presumably is supposed to be able to access, but you wrap it in a system that relies on connections and money and power, and that means that those who have the most resources are the ones who will get the most help. And those who have the least resources are the ones who will continue to be marginalized and disempowered and cut out of opportunity. And that drives inequality, and it drives a whole host of issues that I think most of us would agree we don't want to see, and are not what we think of when we think of our ideal worlds or our beloved communities. But when government services break down, people got to survive. And so I want to talk first about a personal example of a time I've used connections to get help. To be clear, not in a criminal way, more like a call the manager kind of way. During the pandemic, my dad lives in Illinois. He's an Ethiopian immigrant, so I have this awesome name. We were struggling. I was helping him because he doesn't have a computer. I was helping him submit unemployment information. And like a lot of unemployment sites in March and April of 2020, Illinois' website was not so great to work with. I had spent weeks struggling to submit the form. And there was like literally one very clearly technical glitch, one might even say corrupted code, that would not accept a perfectly legal green card number. And I knew if my dad was having this problem, who knew how many other immigrants were having the same issue, accessing resources that they were legally entitled to and that the government intended them to benefit from. So I called a friend. I phoned a friend for help. My friend Oren works in Illinois politics, and I met him because he helped us stand up the New Leaders Council Virginia chapter that I had founded a few years back. And I, first and foremost, wanted a solution. I was like, this is a problem. Who knows how many other people are being impacted? Are there groups already working on this? Do people know? How can I connect my dad with help so that he can stay home and housed and fed? And so I wrote up an email, sent it to Oren. He's like, I think I know some folks who can help. And boy, did he. In one of the most bizarre moments of my life, I had an email response from a deputy secretary of the department that was responsible for the unemployment program. Within 48 hours, a nice gentleman named Jack in the unemployment office had called my dad twice. Previous to this, my dad had been called 77 times and had not spoken to a single living person. He had just been on hold and disconnected, on hold and disconnected. Jack called my dad twice over the course of 2 days. He got set up. My dad was receiving unemployment benefits. It was fixed. I have a lot of complicated feelings about this story. I wasn't asking for a favor. I was asking for a solution. It was the pandemic. I cannot tell you that I know that they fixed that solution for everybody going forward. I do know that the unemployment website works much better, like many websites for unemployment across the country, except for some which have been designed to not work on purpose. It's much better now, and I hope that that helped a lot of other people besides my dad. But also, I don't regret having that conversation because my dad needed help. And I've worked hard to know people and to build systems that work for everyone and to be able to talk to the right people to say, this system isn't working. Here are 3 ideas to make it work for everybody. What do you think? This comes back to the fundamental point that I would have no need to ask for help if the system had worked properly in the first place. Corruption only shows up when something is broken, especially in societies and within politics. It relies on some sort of flaw. And that's where I want us to think about corruption outside of politics. Corruption, and a lot of time when we think of corruption, we think the opposite is purity, but it's not that. When you look at the root word of corruption, the Latin that it comes from, it means bribe, but it also means to mar and to destroy. And the opposite of marring is healing, and the opposite of destruction is creation. And that's important when we want to talk about what can we do to combat corruption. We have to understand the tools that will actually dismantle it and that will stop the need for corruption to arise. because there's a corruption that comes from greed, but there is also corruption that comes from survival. So when we talk about what we need to do, we have to understand that corruption has no party or creed, that corruption is a form of universal social entropy, a rot that will drive the decline of society. And any ideology, any system, any institution, any individual can succumb to it. There are lots of present day and historical examples to refer to, but I think that would get us all a little riled. So instead, we're going to turn to fiction. So let me pull up one of my favorite scenes. And you already know I'm a sci-fi nerd, so get ready, because this is just the first reference. But indulge me with this quick clip from Black Panther. I'm sorry if it's a spoiler, but it has been years, so I'm not that sorry, because you should have watched it by now. It's great. I mean, first of all, what a beautiful scene. That is one of my favorite moments in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, because in Killmonger, we have not a villain, but an antagonist. Both T'Challa and Killmonger think the other one is corrupt. They both think the other one is a threat and a problem that needs to be removed. But at their core, both of them are just trying to protect the vulnerable. They have different definitions of who is vulnerable, and they have different tactics for protection. But one of the reasons why their conflict is so enthralling on the screen is because they are two sides of the same coin. And because they both see the other one, again, as corrupt. T'Challa sees Killmonger as a force not too far off from the colonizers who are there to take vibranium, say that 3 times fast, use it for violence, use it to dominate and control the world, and use it at the expense, potentially, of Wakandans. And T'Challa is there to protect Wakanda, even if he is not happy because he has just been thrust into the role of king due to his father's untimely death. And he's also just been given the burden of knowing the true facts of his father's legacy, which includes the murder of his own brother and the abandonment of his cousin, who we now know as Killmonger. On the flip side, you have Killmonger, who knows what it means to live in the world without the protection of being Wakandan. He knows what it means to be abandoned and to not have the tools to protect yourself from oppression. He has also, in some ways, become a tool of oppression through his career in Black Ops, disrupting and dismantling countries, which comes up earlier in the film. But he also wants to take all of these resources and use it to protect people like him, folks he knows were underprotected and who have been oppressed, marginalized, and disempowered by large, powerful systems. They have a really powerful tension because neither one of them is completely wrong and neither one of them is completely right. And that is, again, one of the things that I think we need to acknowledge when we're talking about how we remove corruption. You have to get beyond the behavior to why is that happening and what values are driving it and what will it take to shift those values and shift the behavior that comes from them. I think it's also really powerful to see the two different tactics around change. And at the end of the movie, again, sorry, not sorry on the spoilers, you see T'Challa actually evolve. You see that, of course, it was a Black woman who had the true way. Lupita Nyong'o's character is like, maybe we could help out a little bit more, but maybe we don't need to go wage a global war in order to do it. And you see that shift happen by the end of the movie. So even though Killmonger's journey as the antagonist has an unhappy ending, the values that he was trying to push for within Wakanda are become manifested, and in some ways that is part of Killmonger's legacy within the film and within the MCU. I love using fiction to explore real-world policy because it gives us the ability to explore some of these ideas at arm's length. It's one of the reasons why I've always loved science fiction and fantasy, because it makes you think about the world, but it gives you freedom to not have to think about all the realities we already know. when I was a kid, I really struggled to read a lot of the greats. Like I've read, I've been reading like it's my earliest memory. But I could not get into some of these like mid-20th century greats, Heinlein, Asimov, a few of those types. And so when I finally did get around to reading them in my mid-20s, honestly, I was shocked at their lack of imagination. And in a lot of ways, reading those books helped me understand how we are where we are today. Because these folks could imagine vast intergalactic empires. They could imagine humans living on Mars. They could imagine all these types of crazy worlds. But you know what they could not imagine? A woman who was the equal of a man. They could not imagine people of color who were nothing more than the worst tokenized caricatures of what people of color were. And when they did write women, they wrote them poorly. And most of the time, they were either the accessory of a powerful man or they were a sex object. Sometimes a liberated sex object, because that's great for the men that they're with, but still an object. And it was shocking to me to realize how deeply bias and what is, again, another form of corruption can be absorbed. So much so that we can't even challenge it because we just, like a fish, think the water is wet. And that's it. I do want to be fair to my beloved genre because sci-fi has also pushed a lot of those boundaries. Star Trek was the first interracial kiss on television. Ursula K. Le Guin explored the dynamics of gender in The Left Hand of Darkness, and Octavia Butler needs no explanation, but if you do need it, I'm happy to talk at length after this. She predicted a lot. But I think that it's really, when we are at a point that our imaginations cannot even challenge something, that is when corruption is at its most threatening and at its most terrifying. And that's why creativity is so vital when we talk about how we dismantle and how we end corruption within the world. I want to indulge me in another vignette. When in 2018, I watched Wrinkle in Time. I loved that book as a kid. My godmother gave me my first copy. It was one of the first, it's really one of the only books that I read and reread routinely because every time I read it, it teaches me something different about the book, the world, and myself. And it is truly one of, oops, sorry folks, gotta get back on my notes. I have loved it and I have never had any problem relating to it, even though there is not a single little black girl in that book. And that was true for a lot of science fiction and fantasy that I read as a kid and as an adult. I've always enjoyed the genre and I've always been able to just kind of insert myself into it. But in 2018, when I got to see Wrinkle in Time in person, and the Ava DuVernay interpretation of it, when she updated the characters and made Meg a biracial nerd with glasses and curly hair, I broke. I started tearing up 20 seconds into that movie. All I had was one sad little napkin from the popcorn station, and boy, that was raggedy by the end of it. I cried for 20 minutes afterwards. I was with my mom. She was crying. It was a really big moment. And I was surprised, honestly. I had no idea I was gonna have that reaction because I've just always loved it. But, I'm sorry, I'm probably gonna tear up now. I cannot explain the power that comes from seeing yourself in your favorite stories. And the way I came out of that, I was like, oh my gosh, I have been doing this little bit of work every time. And finally somebody did it for me. And it was like at 33, my 13-year-old self was healed in a way that I didn't even know it needed. And so that is what I mean when corruption is so deep, we don't even realize how it has fundamentally changed how we're engaging with the world. And I don't consider myself deeply impacted. I have been very fortunate that I have other types of privilege that have helped me navigate the world as a black woman. But if I had been able to see movies like that when I was 13, wow. And I think we see that sentiment with last Sunday's Oscar wins with Michelle Yeoh and Ke Huy Quan being recognized, and just what it means to be able to see a story that was so good. You watch Everything Everywhere All at Once, and it is so deeply moving and relatable and thrilling to see it told from exactly the lens that it was crafted. It wouldn't work the same way if they had written it around different characters and if they had cast a different cast. And I think that that is one of the elements that we have to engage in and dive into, because corruption, when we come to accept it, starts to undermine so much more than we think it does. But it also is why corruption can be so hard to combat, because it's so deeply entrenched, and trying to figure out what is the alternative risks running into all types of political warfare and challenges. And what you really need, or that same kind of dynamic, is actually part of the theme of the story in Wrinkle of Time. At the biggest moment, throughout the story, the big villain is it. It is this force of universal corruption that wants to bend the world and the universe to its way. It wants everybody to operate the way that it's operating for its benefit. And at the climax of the movie, the way Meg defeats the it is through the combination of two forces. She is told by one of her magical godmothers in the book that your strengths are your faults are your greatest strengths. And she is, throughout the book, driven by the love for her brother and her father and her family. And at the climax of the book, it is that love and that stubbornness that combine to create courage that gives her the power to defeat the it. That courage is the same courage we need if we're going to dismantle corruption in our world today, and if we are going to create a better, uncorrupt society for us all. It's hope and action combined that really start to counter corruption, just as creativity is the counter to the destruction. Hope requires creativity and imagination. When despair looms, it's your imagination that lets you sit around and look at everything that's going on wrong around you and think, I could be better. It doesn't have to be like this. What if it was like this? And it's courage and stubbornness and conviction that fuels the fight, that keeps you engaged in action, that keeps you engaged in change making. That tenet in the Creative Mornings manifesto, that everyone is creative, is one of my favorite things. Because for a long time, I've long thought of policymaking as just like world building in science fiction and fantasy. Because it is. I have written sentences that have protected the freedoms of everyone in this room. There are hundreds and thousands of people across the world today who are writing laws and regulations and policies that are shaping the world that we all live in and operate in. That is world building. Those are policies and ideas that could have sat on dusty shelves and white papers that were never used, but somebody figured out a way to put them into action and to manifest them, and to take them from somebody's little crazy brain idea and make it into a reality that we all live with and hopefully benefit from, but we know laws go both ways. So one of the exercises I do with change makers, I call the Thanos snap. Again, I told you there were going to be a lot of references. For those not up to speed on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Thanos is a villain. He collects these Infinity Stones. Again, might be spoilers, but it's been years. He collects these stones and he snaps his fingers, and half of all the humans on the planet disappear. There's implications across the universe as well, but we won't get into that. I think that's a great exercise to do when you want to talk about a policy change. Just, okay, you want something to change? Boom, you've got exactly the solution you want. Are you ready for all the follow-on problems, all of the issues, everything that's going to come from that? Are you ready to defend it from the people who are going to want to undo the change that you've made? Every day in cannabis policy, we're dealing with new challenges. Every day in cannabis policy, I get to be part of creating new worlds. And I'm working with all types of stakeholders, sometimes on the same side, sometimes on opposite sides, to make a new world. And it's really thrilling because in cannabis, we have one of the first instances where we can create a more fair and equitable economy. And we're having serious discussions about how we make economies that work for everyone. How do we make economies that undo specific problems that specific policies created within our communities and had disproportionate impact on Black and Brown Americans across the country? There are a lot of lessons. We don't have any state that's quite figured this out completely, but we are on the right track. And we're definitely going to keep learning from those mistakes and making better and better programs. But I want to tell you a little bit about I want to end with how I got into this cannabis space. Because My first experience with cannabis was in 2018, big year, Wrinkle in Time, weed. Interestingly, both experiences with my mom, but my mom gave me my first edible. I was home in California for Thanksgiving, and my mom was like, do you want to come to my dispensary? And I was like, what is happening? But yes. So I went, and I had my first edible, and I had the best night of sleep I've had in years. Cannabis is now a part of my, I'm a medical patient, it's part of my routine. It has transformed my physical and mental well-being. But that first morning, I woke up in the rental, and I had my feet on this cold tile, feeling like this unbelievable wave of relief that I felt so healed and had finally slept. And right after that came the just uncomfortable feeling of knowing that other people were still incarcerated for the exact same thing. But I leaned into that discomfort because I was working in Virginia politics, so I got in touch with Virginia Normal. J.M. Padini and I started talking about what we could do. Soon I was on the board of Virginia Normal. Started calling around to operators because I was doing what I know how to do best, which is put together a coalition. My first call was to my now boss, so that's how that went. Within 10 months of having my first edible, I was a cannabis executive, which is one hell of a gateway. That is a joke, as is the gateway theory. It is a myth. Happy to send you the papers and the research that prove it. But I say that to say that when you have hope and you are frustrated, take action. And it doesn't have to be action on all things. It doesn't have to be action all the time. This is a lifelong journey. But we have to pick our issues and commit ourselves to showing up for them, the same way that you all have committed to Creative Mornings and showing up in this space and curating it and keeping it a happy, healthy, wonderful space that is welcoming to everyone. But just to summarize, when we all can take that first step, we can all contribute to a better world. And it will take everyone. Unfortunately, unless you are going fully off the grid and living in a mountain hermit life, which please let me know how to make that happen, we're all going to be impacted. And so take action. For me, that action helped me find a calling. But in the face of corruption and in the wake of destruction, the power of hope and action can create new worlds beyond our wildest dreams. So thank you for taking some time to imagine them with me this morning.
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Pleasure.
I want you to keep going. We have time for a question or two. Do we have any questions for Ngiste? I have a question. Here's my question.
Please.
How do you creatively rejuvenate yourself? Obviously, some of that you spoke to, but what are some of the things that you intentionally do for that?
Well, I'll first start by saying probably not enough, because I think we should all be realistic. We all talk about self-care, but we all know that's harder than it sounds. But reading is definitely my number one outlet, as is really good television and movies. Recently I've been doing throwback sitcoms. And let me tell you, that is a great way to experience American history. There are some references in The Nanny that I'm I have no idea who these people were, but clearly somebody was enough of a thing in the 90s to be written into a sitcom joke. But that's probably the best way. And then people, connecting with my friends and family is definitely one of the best and most renewing things.
Beautiful. Yes.
Hey, I would love to hear your thoughts on AI, which has been very buzzy lately, especially maybe in the context of sci-fi, but also in context of corruption as well.
I think AI is, like a lot of things, one of the most thrilling and terrifying things happening right now. And those go hand in hand. Everything that makes it exciting also makes it really scary. And I think that it's too early to tell just yet, and I'll be honest, I'm not the expert we all probably already just realized we need to become in AI. But I think what concerns me the most about AI right now is where are the ethical frameworks and how are we talking about them? And we've already seen the discussions come up, right, with the artists. AI is getting trained on artists' work and is being trained to replace artists. And I've seen it already in multiple papers and presentations, people using AI art for media. And so I think it's too early to tell, but I think those are going to be, I think we're going to have a lot of really exciting stories, and in a few months after that, we're going to start having some really terrifying ones. One I've already seen is somebody who's been using an AI bot to run their dating apps. They said it had secured them 13 dates, but I was like, well, if it's secured you 13 dates, but not a single partner, maybe it's not doing its job super well.
Nicole, and
Hi, I'm Nicole.
Oh, is that the famous Ollie?
Yes, this is my son Ollie. This is definitely like a personal question. Like I'm currently going through like the process of Medicaid and Medicare and those different programs for my son. And it's like a whole different level of corruption that I've ever experienced in my entire
It's
life.
insane.
They make it so accessible. So like this whole talk, like I was just, oh my god, yes. But like I don't have any ties or any links to anything political. Like for us who don't are in that realm, like how if we want to help make change. Like I just like I want to help other people navigate it as well as figure once I figure it out. I mean I'm still trying to figure it out, but like how I don't even know how to go about making that kind of change.
For sure. Well, one, changing the healthcare system, definitely like one of the biggest, baddest bosses in that fight for a lot of reasons. The first thing I would say is if you don't know the website vpap.org, vpap.org, that Virginia is lucky in having one of the best public databases for finding your legislators and also understanding who's paying them or donating to their campaigns. I apologize. All legislators are paid by the state. Or their full-time jobs, because anyways. Sorry, I was about to go off on a tangent. I would say, the first thing I would say is find out who your state representatives are, because Medicaid and Medicare are administered at the state level. But also find your congressional representatives, because you might need both to tag in on a conversation for you. I'm also happy to follow up afterwards. I have to do some thinking, but I know that there are some orgs that focus on healthcare access and specifically navigating patients and helping patients navigate those systems. I just have to do some thinking because I'm a little rusty on what those groups' names are. But there are groups that are trying to at least help. But again, if the Medicaid system is so broken that you need nonprofits organized around helping people navigate it, like why are we not just fixing Medicaid in the first place? But also like, why are we not fixing American health insurance in the first place? I don't know why.
that is a whole nother talk. Last question, yes.
Thank you. Just want to say your connection between creativity and culture was brilliant. Thank you for that. I want to throw some cash on stage. I'm thinking about, we started to get to this at the end, I'm thinking about how do we measure the expensiveness of our vision and creativity, right? Especially in terms of policy or even the work that we do. How do we measure the limits?
I mean, I would like to think it's limitless, but one of the ways I kind of think of it, that's a hard one, because I don't know that it can be measured, and in an ideal world, like that expansiveness would be limitless, right? I think one of the ways to maybe test that, I talk about 3 different types of change that kind of feed into each other. You have incremental, transformational, and revolutionary, and they are each exponentially more impactful than the one before it. And incremental change is the type of small change that maybe you start testing the waters of like, okay, can I get people to move this far? Can I get people to move this far? It's how we got the medical program to where it is today. That type of incremental change can either build momentum for transformational change or eventually become so many small improvements stacked on top of each other that it amounts to a transformational change. I would count a transformational change like when we legalized partially adult use in Virginia. We still have to finish the job. Or Obamacare getting passed, right? There were lots of tiny changes being made to the medical system, and then with the election of President Obama, there was like a big transformational shift in how American health insurance was tackled. But it wasn't a revolutionary shift because it still relied on the existing systems. And I think maybe those are kind of like your 3 orders of magnitude. And the issue with revolutionary change is it usually means that you destroyed something in order to rebuild something in its place. And that's why it is so much both harder to get to, because people are pretty resistant to destruction that's that obvious or that can challenge some of their assumptions that directly. And it can also have a lot of backlash because when you have to rebuild things, there's a lot of room for things to go wrong and a lot of room for opponents to say we better just go back to the way things were. So I don't know if that helps, but I think that's a really good question to keep revisiting.
Thank you so much for
Thank you,
being
Michelle.
here with us today, Ngiste.